36:30.
So there's been many attempts at trying to figure out this issue. If you remember from the DBQ we did earlier, what was it Thomas Jefferson was talking about it, having that nightmare? What was he worried about? What about slavery though? Yeah, well, it could affect the government, and it could affect, it could tear us apart, right? He has that, he writes in his journal, I had this dream where I woke up in the middle of the night, and I'm just terrified this is going to be the undoing of our country. And so there's definitely a lot of foreshadowing, and as a historian, you can look back and go well, everybody saw this coming, right? The Civil War is definitely it's coming down the pipe here. We know it's happening. What we've seen in the 1850s, though, dramatically is more militant responses to slavery. And this is an example of such. Yesterday, we saw some of the examples included Bleeding Kansas, right? Bleeding Kansas was an example of this becoming the first shots fired, really, of the Civil War. Well, allegedly, first shots fired, all right? So, but they are killing each other in Lawrence, Kansas over this. We also have the Dred Scott decision comes down. How does that decision end? Anybody remember?
It basically allows every state to be slaves.
Slavery is legal. There's going to be some rioting going on. Absolutely. The North is absolutely upset with this. The North says this will not stand. This is not acceptable. So, yeah, the Dred Scott decision is pretty bad. John Brown here. Pictured here. Very thought-provoking man right there. John Brown was actually around during the Kansas-Nebraska or Bleeding Kansas feud. So he was there, and he was a violent abolitionist. Now, he didn't start that way. Nobody just immediately goes to violence typically. He had advocated, he had written in newspaper articles, he had given speeches. He definitely was somebody who wanted to end slavery abruptly. He said that, and a lot of the arguments in this time was around the idea of we have to end slavery slowly. It's a gradual process. And he was very frustrated about that. Said, no, absolutely not. Every single day that we have slaves that are kept on their plantations is terrible. It goes against everything we stand for as a country. So John Brown, he was involved there in Bleeding Kansas. He did kill several pro-slavery men in Kansas. And his goal, by the time he gets to Bleeding Kansas, his goal is that he needs to lead a slave revolt throughout the South. He believed also he was ordained by God, that God had spoken to him and said, you, John Brown, will lead the slave revolt. So, to lead the slave revolt, he needs a couple of ingredients, which includes, he needs weapons. He believes that if he can go and free the first group of slaves and give them weapons, it'll be a chain reaction. Slaves revolting against their masters and overtaking the South. That's kind of his dream that he wants to accomplish there. All right. Good so far? Mr. John Brown. The notes are really short today. Afterwards, I have this really cool speech that we're going to read over my favorite orator. He's one of the best speakers ever, Abraham Lincoln.
Four score.
I think it's really cool. No, it's not the Gettysburg Address. As much as I love that, we will do the Gettysburg Address. And what's cool about the Gettysburg Address, and I'll get more into that later, but it's so super short. It's like 2 paragraphs long.
No.
You can read it in like 3 minutes, the whole Gettysburg Address. But it says so much. It's probably one of my favorite pieces of writing I've ever read in my life. I think it's really good. So I'm a big fan of Abraham Lincoln and his writing style. Okay, so what else about this guy? So, John Brown is going to go after a U.S. ammunition depot. This is a place where the military just kind of stores its weapons. It's like a main stockhold. Back in those days, not as heavily guarded as you might see on TV today. So he goes to Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which is just a holding area for these weapons, in October of 1859 to capture weapons. So he's going to essentially, he's going to try to go there. He goes there with some of his family members are with him as well. He also has a few freemen that he has gotten onto his side to agree with him that this is the way to go about it. He attacks Harper's Ferry, a military installment. He moves in, attempting to get the weapons, and eventually the military will surround him. This mission will ultimately fail and John Brown will eventually surrender, but not before several of his men and even a couple of his sons are killed in the fighting. So this ultimately fails. It doesn't work. But it's a very scary thought to many of the people of the South. The Southerners are terrified, and they begin to point fingers at John Brown and say, look, if there's one of them, there's 100 of them. And more people are going to be doing this. They said, look, Dred Scott decision says slavery is legal. So you cannot be having these people having these crazy attacks all the time. So this is the military coming in and subduing the John Brown's men here. You can see the brick building in the background. This is the munitions depot at Harper's Ferry. And so they end up capturing John Brown, and the guy leading this is Robert E. Lee of the United States government. Robert Lee will go on to head the Confederacy as the main.
General Lee from Dukes Hazzard?
That's the, well, not exactly, but General Lee, if you're talking about the Dukes of Hazzard, and if you're in the South, yeah. Well, you notice that they have the
Confederate flag.
They have the Confederate flag on the hood of their car, which we'll talk about the repercussions of the Confederate flag later in Civil War history. But it's kind of interesting. But yeah, the General Lee, named after Robert Lee. Robert Lee at the time, the best general and commander in the United States. He had experience during the Mexican-American War, so he's a veteran now. He's had battle-hardened experience. He will be the best commander in all of the Civil War, and he will be on the side of the South. All right, so John Brown is captured. Some of his men are killed. He is put on trial for treason. Now, in the North, they're going to run pictures like this, where he looks like almost a saintly Santa Claus, kissing black babies as he comes down the steps to the gallows. He looks very peaceful, looks very calm demeanor. He is found guilty of treason, sentenced to death. His last words before he hung for what he did said, "I believe the issue of slavery will never be solved unless through the shedding of blood." So more foreshadowing of the Civil War and what's to come. Many people in the North thought, what a sweet man for attempting to do this. His heart was in the right place. He just made a mistake. Southerners were absolutely terrified. And this is where we talk about the idea of generalizing, right? If we think that one person speaks for everybody. So the South believed that everyone in the North was as radical as John Brown. But it's not true. Not everybody's going to go and take on an army depot. But at the same time, the South was absolutely terrified. And they went to the government saying, what are you going to do about this? This guy is trying to overtake a military installment in the name of going against a Supreme Court case that just came out, in the name of going against the institution of slavery. What are we going to do about this? We have to make sure this does not happen again. So the South is freaking out, definitely, for good reason. So the South kind of says, look, we might just have to leave. Like, people in the North are just never going to get it. They're never going to understand slavery. So maybe we should just start our own country. Now, if you remember, they've been threatening to secede forever. I mean, even when during the Constitutional Convention, Southern delegates would get upset when they talked about slavery and threatened to say, well, this thing's not going to work. So they've been threatening to secede for 60 plus years. This is very fresh in their mind that, this could happen. Definitely a possibility. This is how the South saw John Brown. This is the picture of John Brown that ran in the South. As you can see here, his powers are comparable to that of Storm from X-Men, clearly conjuring up large storms in the background here. And of course, if he's holding a book, what is that going to be? What symbol?
The Bible.
The Bible. So he believes he's doing God's work. Notice still has the beard, but yet a little bit of, I don't know what you would call righteous indignation on his face.
He's a turtle looking dude.
Which one are you looking at? This one?
No, like he looked like a turtle in the picture.
Oh, yeah, I guess so. That's true.
And now he has a beard.
Well, I mean, he's been cooped up in jail for a while during his trial, and they're not going to go in and necessarily always shave him. So, I mean, the fact that he had a beard is probably the only thing that was accurate between these two pictures. So here's how the North sees John Brown, and here's how the South sees him. Very different.
Wait, is he stepping on white men?
He's stepping over. Now, I will suggest that this painting, most likely of John Brown, was definitely painted a few years after the Civil War, but still kind of the effect of John Brown has this idea that the people that followed him in the North believed he was a martyr. that he died trying to do something really good. That other people, and this is the scary thing about a martyr sometimes, other people should follow this guy. And that's what the South was really worried about. So when he's stepping over bodies here, and notice that one's in blue, one's in white, suggesting that there's a Confederate and a Union soldier here, that he's stepping over them, that essentially his will is greater than anything else. It doesn't matter to him about keeping the country unified. He's just trying to free the slaves, and that's it. He thinks he's God, essentially. And that's kind of the message that the artist is trying to convey in here. That is he a martyr or is he a madman? You know, is he insane? And that's kind of an interesting question. Harriet Tubman, very famous abolitionist, of course. Yes, she did the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman, when she hears about John Brown's execution, said this of him: "I've been studying and studying upon it, and it's clear to me it wasn't John Brown that died on the gallows." Right, the gallows is where you get hung. "When I think how he gave up his life for our people, and how he never flinched but was so brave to the end, it's clear to me it wasn't mortal man, it was God in him." So, very high praise from Harriet Tubman, that she believed that his work was divine, which is powerful. Not everybody, though, shared their reverence of Brown. Republican presidential candidate Abraham Lincoln said this about John Brown: "The Brown affair in its philosophy corresponds meaning has a relationship with the many attempts related in history. At the assassination of kings and emperors, an enthusiast broods over the oppression of a people till he fancies himself commissioned by heaven to liberate them." Now remember, too, an enthusiast, somebody who's very excited, broods. Broods means like stews over something, to think a long time. We've all been there. We something bothers us, and then we just explode. We've been thinking about it for a while. So, once again, John Brown, an enthusiast broods over the oppression of a people, slaves, till he fancies himself commissioned by heaven to liberate them. He ventures the attempts, right? He tries to do it, which ends in little else than his own execution. Essentially saying that this was poorly executed. This was a plan not well thought out. That's kind of what Abraham Lincoln believed on it. So a lot of different ideas here. Once again, same thing remains, where they're very conflicted on how they believe about it. This is what we're going to look at today. So this is the last slide here. So just a little bit of background information on the speech that you're going to read. This is a speech that originally was intended for the citizens of Illinois, because Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, remember Stephen Douglas, the little giant, the really creepy Oompa Loompa in that picture? They're both running for a senatorial position. Stephen Douglas is Mr. Popular Sovereignty, right? Let's let the states choose, which we all know how that ended up, right? Bleeding Kansas, not very good. So Lincoln is running against him, and they continuously are addressing and talking about the ideas of slavery. And Abraham Lincoln has some very interesting thoughts on what he wants to do with slavery. The debates, though, were supposed to only be followed by the citizens of Illinois. They were actually going to be followed by more than that. Both of these candidates would eventually attempt to run for president in 1860, which we know Abraham Lincoln is going to win. However, Abraham Lincoln does lose the senatorial race. So it's kind of interesting that Lincoln loses the first round and comes back to win as president. And so Lincoln, in the speech that we're going to read, is called the very famous House Divided Speech.